Herzlich willkommen zurück zum Tag der Konrad-Adenauer.
Welcome back to the CUS Open Day. We just heard about innovation, went to Singapore at least virtually, and saw some autonomous buses in Karlsruhe. Should you have missed that event, you can find the live stream as a recording later. We will now move on to another core topic of the Adenauer Foundation, which is that of security. Next to me is Amelie Stelzner, who works in the Division for International Politics and Security and a spokesperson for Federal Army and Society at the Adenauer Foundation. You will facilitate the discussion entitled Respect for People in Uniform. Can you tell us why you think that is a relevant topic and why we should talk about it? Thank you very much, Miguel, for the introduction and a warm welcome from my side to today's discussion round. This topic is relevant in many respects. Respect and valuing someone is part of social cohesion, or is a precondition for social cohesion and a strong community. This means we have clubs and societies and associations on the one hand, we have state institutions and organizations, we have constitutional organs, and this social cohesion results from this being essential for our internal security and strengthening the resilience of our country. And people in uniform as representatives of the state are of utmost importance for social cohesion, and therefore respect towards people in uniform plays an important role. Throughout the pandemic, we have seen the central role people in uniform play and what contributions they have made, what achievements they have seen. But at the same time, we can see violence against people in uniform. For example, policemen and women. People are talking about a loss of trust in state institution. And it is against this backdrop that I am very pleased that we're addressing this topic here at the Adenauer Foundation. Amelie, who will be your panelists today? We have three very exciting panelists, and I'm very happy about that. And I will discuss the topic from different perspectives, from the point of view of the German army with Lieutenant General Weicht, from the point of view of politics with Burkhard Dregger, and the point of view of the police with Sabine Schumann. She has been a police officer for the land of Berlin for 30 years. She is currently with the Water Protection Police, and she speaks to us today in her role as Deputy Federal Chairwoman of the German Union of the Police Forces. Lieutenant General Jürgen Weicht has been with the Bundeswehr, the German army, for 44 years. In Germany as well as abroad, he's been to Afghanistan. He is Deputy Inspector of the Troops, and he is also responsible for the reserve. I would like to also welcome Burkhard Dregger, who has been in the parliament since 2011. He's chairman of the CDU parliamentary group at the Berlin House of Representatives. This sounds really exciting, and I am looking forward to the discussion. But let us first hear the Minister President of the Free State of Saxony with a small video message. Our society and our positive community are carried by many pillars. One of the pillars is the men and women in uniform who represent our security, who defend the institutions of state and society. This event is dedicated to them. This event is directed at them to make visible what they do, to say thanks on behalf of many, many people in our country who can't do that themselves. And we want to ask the question, what are they concerned about? What needs do they have? where do they see the development of our society in the years and decades to come? I'm very grateful to the Adenauer Foundation for choosing this format and this topic. It is more important than ever. I hear a lot of information about attacks on police women and policemen. We can see how our soldiers have to defend themselves, justify themselves. But on the other hand, as soon as there's a catastrophe, as soon as there's an emergency, we are so grateful that they exist. A large majority of people in our country trusts both the police as well as the German army, as well as the other state institutions. I would like to thank you for your work. A very interesting contribution from the Saxonian Minister President. Mr. General, we just heard that the majority of people are behind people in uniform. From the point of view of the Bundeswehr, the German army, what's your opinion? Thank you very much, Mrs. Stelzner, to give us the opportunity to discuss this topic, because it is an important topic. It is also one that isn't being discussed often. If we talk about the relationship between the military and society, I think first and foremost, it is important that we talk about, or that we start talking about, what the basis of this relationship is, so that everyone knows that soldiers of the Federal Armed Forces are, or their tasks are controlled by our basic law. Article 37A says we have armed forces for defense. So it's a decision of the community to reason or to argument for such a relationship, and a task that is stipulated by our basic law means we protect the citizens, we protect the country, and included in that is protecting our partners. And very often that is neglected in this context. And first of all, we must never forget this. And secondly, the life of a soldier starts with an oath that each and every soldier takes at the beginning of their service, which is voluntary, by the way. And that's something that we need to emphasize again. So they swear, they take an oath to protect the rights and the freedom of the German people. That is the basic precondition. What you also need to know is we are part of the executive power, like the police forces, like many others. In a service that for us is natural, but under civil leadership and under parliamentarian control. So why am I trying to include the basic law or the constitution in such thin words? Well, irrespective of how I as a person think about topics such as military, soldiers, wars, we all need to be aware that, first of all, this is a service that people decide to do voluntarily in order to serve the community, to serve everyone. And this is meant to emphasize what I said in the beginning. In the oath that soldiers take, we talk about the right and the freedom that are to be defended. And who wants to be free needs to be ready to protect this freedom. And you don't have to wear uniform to do that, but you have to do this in your thoughts, in your will. And therefore, I think it is extremely important, and I hope we can discuss that in more detail today, that the question of respect is not respect towards a uniform, a piece of clothing, but rather the respect, first and foremost, towards a human being. A person in uniform has the same rights as any other person living in this country. Secondly, the way that we show respect or do not show respect makes it very clear how we think about the freedom and the community. And therefore, respect towards a person in uniform is an expression, in my view, of my relationship with the community in which I live. And therefore, I think the question of how this respect should be expressed has nothing to do with being of the same opinion, has nothing to do with having to share all those views. But first and foremost, that's something I would want to have more. Don't look at the uniform, look into our faces, discuss with us, have a different opinion, but don't throw stones or don't insult, because that would be losing respect towards the community and not just towards the person it is addressed to. So much as a first statement from me on this really exciting topic. Thank you very much, Lieutenant General. I think it's important to talk about the fact that we have a parliament army. We have an army that is there for the people who have been voted for. We have had the first questions coming in. If you would like to ask more questions, please do so. We are very excited about them. Please tell us who would you like to address the question to, or whether you want to address them to everyone, and we'll try to include as many questions as possible. Mrs. Schumann, we have just heard the general's words. From your point of view of the Union of Policemen and Women, what do you say? Well, people who choose to join the police force, they have filtered out a certain characteristic of identification. You choose this, you know that from day one you wear the uniform. You cannot go through life anonymously anymore. And to become a police officer is one of the most popular choices ever. And I mean, we're very happy about this. And you have to go through a selection process. And then for the very first time, when you wear the uniform, you have to live this identification in view of the public. Somebody who repairs a lift in your house, they take off the uniform and go home and you can't recognize them anymore. But if you wear a police uniform, you will be recognized as the police every day when you go out somewhere. And that's what our colleagues do. Our colleagues have also taken an oath on the Constitution. So they do not wear the uniform as an end in itself, but rather in order to fulfill their job. And if we go out somewhere, then somebody has asked us for help and we try to find a solution. We have to be very creative sometimes, and then afterwards, sadly, and I think this brings us to the question of respect. As a union representative, I don't want to hear people saying it's just about the uniform. We have a phenomenon of brutalization in society. We had an example where firemen and women were trying to put out a fire and people threw stones at them. And I mean, how can this be? How can you attack people, firemen, firewomen, policemen with stones? Who does that? And sadly, those examples show us the real world out there. Yes, we are recognized, we are popular, but there is a part of the population that is not happy with the services provided for the public. And in every single minute that we have to spend defending ourselves, I mean, there are laws and regulations that stipulate that measures we can and have to take, that we are entitled to do so. We can't stand there saying, well, it's getting critical, let's pack up and go home. So the images that we see that people take with their smartphones, they just capture pictures and are then used to actually make a decision on what happened before all the facts have been collected. That means a judgment has been passed already, and we have to work against that. So I think respect starts with the reporting, with the journalism already. You mentioned it. There are a lot of different aspects when it comes to respect, when it comes to appreciation. And we heard two perspectives now. And I would like to move on to you, Mr. Dreger, from your point of view as a parliamentarian, as a politician. Well, the CDU parliamentary group at the Berlin House of Representatives is standing behind our federal armed forces and the police. 100%. Also, against the backdrop of current discussions, I'm not trying to hide anything here. I would like to look at basic facts. When we look at complaints against Berlin police in the year 2019, how many reproaches were there that there were wrong discrimination, or how many were there? We have 33 million hours of service every year, and then we have 14 cases that are reported as being discriminatory in any way. 85% of people trust in the police forces. That's more than the constitutional court. Maybe in Berlin, there are a few more people who disagree, but my colleagues from the Berlin police force are worthy of my respect and appreciation. I am also a reservist for the German armed forces. I did my obligatory military service after school, and during the corona pandemic, I have seen so much engagement that made me really happy. Berlin was supported by the armed forces more than any other federal land. Up to 1,500 soldiers were working non-stop, not just regarding transporting and storing equipment, protective gear, but also when it came to the vaccination centers, the test centers, logistics. The support was immense. Imagine last year on Christmas Eve, within 24 hours, we mobilized 220 soldiers from all over Germany. They were deployed to Berlin, to pensioners' homes to control access there. And it seems the Senate wasn't able to mobilize its own staff, but rather it was the soldiers. They were family fathers and brothers and family members who would have liked to spend Christmas at home. But they didn't say no, they didn't complain. It was what they had to do and what they wanted to do. And they said, well, I did talk to my wife, but my wife said to me, last year you were in Afghanistan to serve our country. This year you are in our own country to serve the country. You are here. It wasn't discussed. It was just a matter of course. It was a matter of fact. And that makes me proud and that makes me happy as a parliamentarian that we have armed forces that can support us in times of crisis. And I want to add one thing. Without the federal armed forces in Berlin, we wouldn't have seen such progress with regard to vaccination. It took a long time until the civil side, irrespective of the armed forces, had built up the capabilities for mass inoculations. The armed forces were mobilized within 24 hours and they did a fabulous job. I'm very happy. Berlin has to catch up when it comes to the acceptance of the armed forces, at least with some people. But throughout the pandemic, I think the armed forces have done such a great job that the acceptance has increased because people have seen, well, they do help me as an individual. They help me fight dangers, and I do respect both the police forces as well as the armed forces.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have a question in a second, but before I ask this question, one remark for our audience. We do not just want to start a conversation based on the questions that you're sending in. You will also have the opportunity for about 2 minutes to answer 2 questions that you will see for 2 minutes. And we will then discuss them here. Mr. Dräger, you mentioned the services rendered by the German armed forces during the corona pandemic. Do you have the impression that this has been appreciated and respected? And do you think that this has had an impact on the relationship between the German armed forces and German society? Yes, I think we are on a good track towards a comprehensive acceptance of the German armed forces. I think that this goes without saying in many federal states. Germany, because of its specific history, is lagging behind. Unfortunately, we have a high share of extremists in the city, and thus also a high share of extremism-driven crimes against police officers and other people in uniform. So these people haven't understood this yet. But what is also part of the truth is that there is still work that needs to be done with policymakers when it comes to the acceptance of German armed forces. I talked to a colleague of the Berlin Senate recently. I'm not going to tell you which member of party she is, but she visited the German armed forces for the first time, and she said this is like the technical institution, the technical Hilfswerk. They can do so many things and they are great. So this showed that she did appreciate the services rendered by the German armed forces. And we do not just, or the German armed forces do not just defend the country against external threats, but also when it comes to a pandemic. You have your own army in your country, which is better than another country, another army. So with regards to the security situation internationally, so 120,000 Russian soldiers at the Ukrainian borders who were mobilized within a short period of time recently. This was a political message to the West. And we have to bear in mind that we need German armed forces. We are totally defensive, but we have to be able, and we are able to defend ourselves against any type of threat. Thank you very much. Answers are coming in, but before we turn to these answers, I have another question to Lieutenant General Weicht. You are a general of the Bundeswehr and Deputy Inspector of the troops. The troops basis was in the focus last year. During the corona pandemic, they turned to the troops for additional support and aid. There was also voluntary service, also part of the troops. So a comprehensive portfolio. And I would like to come back to the current issue of the corona pandemic. So here's my question for you, Mr. Weicht. It's a similar question that I also posed to Mr. Dräger. So the German armed forces made a huge contribution to managing the COVID pandemic. Has the relationship to society changed? What do you think? Well, I think that this is a question that you cannot answer with yes or no. And I don't think that this is the crucial factor. First of all, Mr. Dräger, thank you very much for your words. Not so much for your praise or for your form and type of appreciation. And I really want to highlight this again. Soldiers don't want to be appreciated. I mean, years and years ago, we had similar debates, which you might remember, but we are all humans, and it makes us happy that our operations, our work is appreciated by those that we help and defend directly. What do I mean by that? I think it is not totally crucial for us if we in votings, and I'm not criticizing anything in this context, but that in the charts, we rank first. No, people who we have helped openly and directly tell us that our pledge, our oath, has been translated into reality. We have delivered, in other words, and in a society, in the current circumstances, it is very difficult to communicate what soldiers do in Afghanistan, in Mali, etc., for the maintenance of the society. By the way, this is rather a political task to explain this. But if you have a chance to do something in your own country to prove that we are not the better technical aid institution, but that we are able, that our soldiers are able and motivated to become active wherever need is necessary, help is necessary. And what I have learned during many visits where soldiers became active in order to manage the COVID-19 crisis, what I remember most and found most impressive was a nurse in an ICU in the city of Ludwigshafen. She hugged two relatively young soldiers and she called them their Christmas gifts because on the 25th of December, they arrived there in a very difficult situation because this intensive care unit at the time had many patients, also many staff had corona at the time. So sort of overnight, they had to be taken out of service. At the same time, the department was full with patients. Without dramatizing this, but this is a type of appreciation that these two soldiers will never forget. They will say, what I have sworn, I have experienced, and I have shown this in a very specific case. So the image of the German armed forces is something that everybody has to sort out for themselves. And this brings me back to my initial statement. Everybody has to understand that if they want to be free, if they want to be member of a society that stands for freedom and for rights, then I need to sort out what my relationship is to the ones that defend this. So I cannot claim for myself that I am fair, that I want to be treated fairly based on the basic law, but those who enforce this law and these rights are deprived of this. That doesn't fit. These things don't merge. Having said that, I hope that because of the COVID-19 operations, there's more awareness of the question of respect when it comes to dealing with those who help defend this country and manage this crisis here in the country. So this gives us a huge opportunity and we like helping. But Mr. Draeger said it very clearly, this is not our main task. We are not specialized in this. And as quickly as possible, we will have to go back to the original tasks of the German armed forces. And of course, Corona has also had an impact on the German armed forces, and we have to manage these implications. We have to guarantee that our original tasks can again be exercised and implemented. All right, I'm looking at the screen now. So our audience said that 61% think that the image of the German armed forces has improved because of the operations of soldiers during the fight against the pandemic. 36% say not changed. So you can see that soldiers have been visible during the pandemic because they have made a huge contribution that we have just discussed, a contribution made by the soldiers in this country. Now, I would like to focus on other questions that were raised by the audience. And I would like to ask you, and this is a question for Ms. Schumann, how the respect for police officers has developed in the last years. You briefly mentioned it already, but what challenges do you see at the moment? And a small share of the population, of course, can have huge implications on society. Well, initially you said that I have been working for the police forces for 30 years. So I have made quite a few personal observations, and I also talk to colleagues across the country. Of course, we have seen and learned that normal facts, and I call them normal facts, and in the past, there was a different approach of solving issues. And I think this has changed. Operations and missions have changed. And police officers now are aware of what kind of dangers could be looming during an operation. Now, we have different concepts in the different federal states, and operation training is now in the center. Colleagues are well prepared to these operations, but there are still things that happen that nobody had thought about beforehand, that were not communicated. So situations that seem to be simple can be totally different, can materialize totally differently. And this is also a danger when it comes to the issue of respect. We also talked about violence against police officers. Well, if in public discussions, the boogeyman is quickly found with police forces or with German armed forces, then of course it is difficult. Well, there is a young, dynamic police squad that comes to a specific place, and then there's hatred being shown by people. And then you have to ask yourself, what has happened there? In the run-up to this, on the other side, there had been probably a very difficult feeling, a very difficult opinion. And the colleagues of this police squad cannot be blamed for this. I'm repeating myself, and I like repeating myself, to be very honest. If policymakers immediately after an operation or during rallies, for instance, unfortunately, it is like during soccer games. Those watching the soccer games know best how to play. So they evaluate and judge the operation without waiting for the facts. So what is being protected by basic law is that we need a judicial assessment of facts and of circumstances. But social media are faster. Now, everybody can handle social media, but people out there judge things very quickly. You also have falsified videos, etc., that are then being used in order to blame the police for things. And the individual who is potentially totally shocked in terms of how they are defined and depicted. Well, let me say a police officer who shows a heart during an operation causes judgments. Why? And I don't really want to be one of those police officers because it is very difficult to remedy this. I mean, these are people in uniform and they have to tackle this almost every day. They only want to help people, but people turn these things into different facts. And the role model function is what we need to focus on. And the media sometimes distort this image, unfortunately. Now, Mr. Dreger, it has already been mentioned, i.e. the role of policymakers when it comes to mastering all these challenges, and also when it comes to confronting the problems that Ms. Schumann just said. So what do you think? What is the role of policymakers? What should they do? What could they improve? Well, I just would like to pinpoint this just to make clear. I think political parties have to ask themselves if they want to stabilize the democratic country governed by the rule of law or whether they want to destabilize it. This is also what we are confronted with here in Berlin. We have seen a 4-year coalition government in Berlin that in different legislative projects has done everything in order to reduce the trust in the legal bodies. So based on different accusations against the police in the area of racism. The police was said to be racist in general unless the police proves otherwise. This is part of the Berlin law that was passed here. I mean, I don't want to be misinterpreted and misunderstood. We have to fight discrimination, but effectively. And I mentioned the numbers earlier. If you have 13 discrimination allegations against 17,000 police officers that serve for 33 million hours, then this is not enough to turn the burden of proof to the detriment of police officers in service. So this legislative initiative that was now also, or is now also being implemented in other countries, in other federal states, sorry, a foundation was laid to question the enforceability of police forces, because now they have to defend themselves against discrimination accusations that are unjustified. They have to be able to defend themselves at any time. And they also tried to reduce the trust of people in the police. And this really hurts, because we have another problem in Berlin. We have a number of 44% when it comes to finding out how crimes were committed and who committed a crime. So less than half of crimes can be sorted out. So the rule of law obviously sometimes doesn't prevail. And if there are now forces that try to aggravate the situation, then this is even more difficult. So we need a debate based on facts. And we have to force everybody to provide facts and not to spread emotions. Is there racism in the German armed forces? Is there racism in the police? Is the question. But if we look at the facts, then let's see what will happen to the allegations. And we will see that these are very, very small numbers that don't give any reason to reduce the trust in the German armed forces or in the police forces. And therefore, I am clearly supporting the armed forces and the police forces. And I like to be attacked in proxy of them, but we have reached a point in debates in Germany where there is a risk that those who defend the rule of law are always blamed for things and are always attacked. And now we have to decide whether we want this or allow this to happen, or whether we take up the courage to counter this.
I have just seen that our viewers support this. About 70% of our viewers say that respect towards policemen and women has increased over the past few years or changed in a positive way. And that brings me back to the armed forces. A question from the public. General, in order to show respect and appreciation for soldiers, can it be useful to give soldiers certain discounts, for example, in everyday life? Well, first of all, we can say that there are certain discounts or advantages that we already have. For about 2 years, we've had the case that soldiers in uniform can ride federal trains free of charge. And I think that is something that my comrades have accepted very readily. I think your question may have pointed towards the United States, where soldiers, when they go shopping for clothes, for example, there are special days where they can do that and get a military discount. There are other countries where they get free entry to museums or sites. I think that's not something. I'm talking for myself here. I'm speaking for myself here. I can't remember a discussion that I had with soldiers where somebody said very vehemently, that's what we need. What we would like, what we would be happy about, and again, this is my individual opinion. If in the United States people approach you, maybe children, and they will say, I mean, I'm not an American soldier or an American officer, but they will say to me a very simple sentence. They'll say, thank you for your service, sir. These are moments, and that may sound a little bit over the top or even a bit kitschy, but that is really balm for the soul because it's unexpected, because it happens naturally, and especially if it's children expressing that, it goes to your heart. It's music in your ears. And if you ask me, do I want this for Germany? I mean, it's happened to me here as well. A few weeks ago, when I did a security check at the airport, one of the controlling security people said, Mr. General, it is a shame that I have to control you. And I said, no, it's not a shame, but I say it's a joy that you tell me. That's enough for me. So the question, how to pass on respect and appreciation. And I'd like to include our colleagues from the police forces in this. There is a difference whether we talk about the published opinion or the public opinion. I think the public opinion, to a large extent, is on our side, understands us, and they don't have to tell us that every day or pat on our shoulders every day. If I then look at the published opinion, like any other area of society, we have to bow to the laws of modern media. We will do that. Sometimes I would ask for more fairness. And looking back on a situation and judging it, we don't have to argue about this is much easier than having a complex situation where you have nanoseconds to make a decision and to act very consequential actions. And that is not something that an outsider can judge. And I would ask for more fairness for situations like this. And if it's just a few things, wrongdoing, misconduct on the side of the police forces or the army, I'm trying to make this very clear to the young soldiers. They have to be very clear. You mentioned it. You're not anonymous. You don't just act as an individual. Whatever you do, your action will have consequences, and your misconduct will radiate far beyond or emanate far beyond your own sphere. But we must never forget, people in the uniform are human beings with all their positive characteristics, and sometimes sadly also with the negative ones. But I would ask for a more balanced view when checking the facts. And once misconduct has been determined, then I think you may criticize what you call our organization. We know how to deal with criticism, but it needs to be justified criticism, and it needs to be a fair discussion where everyone is heard and can have a say, where there is no action of prejudgment or pre-condemning someone. And we do not differentiate being in service or out of service. They don't apply because we're in service 24/7, 365 days a year. That's really interesting because respect and appreciation go both ways. And soldiers are a citizen in uniform, so they are both. And as those who wear a uniform, you have a special focus that's placed on you, on yourself. Thanks to our Federal Minister of Defense, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, we have seen that the military has been made more visible with public oaths or with them taking the trains for free. You are also spokesperson for reservist matters, and the reserve is supposed to be increased, for example, for protecting the home country. How do you see the role of those reservists? I think it is difficult when we have about 250,000 people in the reserves. If we want to look at areas that are sort of beyond the armed forces, and this is not a judgment, it's just a fact. If I do not have sons or daughters who are in a relationship, if I do not have direct contact outside with friends, if my first hobby is not security policy, then it might happen that that is an area that I don't really know how to access beyond official formats. But on the other hand, if I know people who are in the service temporarily, let's say those who are in the reserves and who temporarily step into that military world, then the discussion will change, because there's that latent reproach of lobbyism. Nobody expects me to talk in a negative way about the organization that I am part of. But if it's a colleague, if it's somebody from your circle of friends, the credibility is huge. And beyond, to convey what is done within the Bundeswehr, within the armed forces. In the 80s, we had a duty to serve, and then in 2021, we don't, and a lot has changed, even though the exterior may have remained more or less the same, but all of this has changed, and that plays a role. You talked about this voluntary service to protect the country. As one of the co-responsible people for this project, I have talked to hundreds of young applicants over the last few months, and I was very impressed by the attitude that I saw with them, because very often the young generation is stereotypically described as a generation that is mainly interested in technical gimmicks and whatnots, that has social deficits. But those that I met, those I talked to, the large majority of them expressed the idea that they see this as an opportunity to give something back to the country they live in and the community they live in. They say, of course, there are other opportunities to do that, but they consciously choose homeland security. But they don't want to take this large step. For example, they don't want to be deployed abroad. They want to think about it first. And I think you cannot have a more mature young generation than that. I mean, at least those who I met. you can say, of course, there are great advantages, a stable employer, quite a good income, and a lot of others. But nevertheless, they say before I take this step, before I really bind myself to this organization, so that this organization can ask things of me that at the moment I am not too clear about, I will take small steps and approach this topic from another point of view. And that's something that I think will enrich the German armed forces. And it's not about increasing the quantity of reservists in the army, but rather that we increase the quality, that we have people who understand and that they want to do this. I think that's a very important aspect. And you talked about wanting to give back being very important. And that's something that also applies to the police forces. As you said, Mrs. Schumann, there are a lot of applicants, but when we look at the audience questions again, there's a question that is directed at both of you. We have already talked about violence against policemen and policewomen. From your point of view, what do you think needs to be done in order to address or tackle this problem? Well, first of all, the use of language in public, the judgment of situations. Also, as a role model for children, whatever we do, the children will repeat or copy. And if a situation is discussed and taken apart in public already, if we have a police car coming to an event or to an assembly, the operation is running, but the people are already saying, well, state action, is on vogue, let's be against it. That's wrong. And if you want the state to function, Mr. Weig said it really nicely, the rules have to apply and have to be enforced. So we can't have every individual saying, well, today I want to have it differently. You said that, but I don't like it. This is not how a state works. This is not how coexistence in a state works. And throughout the pandemic, we all had to learn very quickly to deal with new rules and regulation. There was no law that told us exactly what to do. There was no Article X and Y that told us what to do. And so you really have to be very careful in addressing certain situations. You have to have an instinctive feeling on how to tackle a situation, and every operation needs to be looked at with the same instinct to see how are we going to do this, and then let it go, instead of having people stand there from the very beginning saying, this is the police, whatever they're doing is not right. Every person has the right, if they're not happy with the measures taken by the police, to have them examined by a court. But don't just stand there, put your hands on your hips and saying, no, I'm not doing it. And you mentioned it as well. Everyone seems to have the right to want things to be differently and to implement that. And I think that is not going to work. And we're going to have to say that. Allow me to pass that question on to you, together with another question that we got from the audience. As you are now a member of the Berlin House of Representatives, you know about the decision of the SPD from 2019 to prohibit young officers from going to schools. Well, I think that was a wrong decision. And even though there was a majority of SPD members who didn't like that, or who weren't in favor of it, it still happened. Some people in the SPD said it's not about convincing people to serve with a machine gun, but rather to explain to people that we have a parliamentary army that is subject to the decisions of the parliament, that there is a citizen of the same state in that uniform who will decide between orders that are given illegally, unlawful and lawful orders. I don't want to comment this, but I hope it's going to be corrected very soon, possibly as a consequence of the fabulous service given throughout these pandemic times. That was rubbish. That decision was pure rubbish. Let me just say one more sentence also on the question of violence against police forces. The decisive fact is that our state has to act decisively. But the problem is that we lack staff. The courts cannot keep up. So if offenders see that they can commit a crime without being persecuted, then they will continue. And that's currently the status quo. In Berlin, that is a really big problem. So the idea cannot be to weaken the constitutional state, but rather to strengthen it. And that as soon as there has been an offense committed, that there will be an accusation, a charge. And the constitutional state has to win rather than run behind. And that's a core debate in our domestic and security policy in Berlin and also in our country. In Berlin, we have a crime clearance rate of less than 50%. So the constitutional state is not able to solve enough cases. And that also means, that also applies to cases of violence against the police force. So we have to trust in the people who serve the state, and we have to equip them with whatever it is that they need, and then we can see that there are no repeat crimes. That's a perfect point to move on to a final round.
So here's a question for the three of you, and please give me 1 or 2 sentences, and you have already raised it, Mr. Dreger, but maybe what is the most important thing? What is the biggest challenge that you see? So a thing that you would implement first in order to improve respect and appreciation for people in uniform. Should I start? Yes, please. So I would like to focus on best practices in the area of the police and of the German armed forces and also of the fire brigades to show that people, and these are people who serve all of us, and I would like to also include the justice system. So those who still think that they have to raise their hands against a police officer and thus raise their hands against the state governed by the rule of law, that they are accused of that immediately. And this needs to be enforced immediately. Yes, we want a functioning state and we want to protect rights and these people, and the people who do these jobs, and these are people in uniform, have to be supported in this. General, well, I want to see more discussions like this. And the question should not always be what is legal or what is illegal. No, I want to see debates focusing on what is decent and what is not decent. And I think this is something that I want to see personally as a soldier, but also as a human being, as a citizen, as a father, so that we put an end to judging whether things are legal or not. And if they are legal, I just do them. But for me, it is about, is this decent? Do we deal with each other with decency? And things that are under the threshold of legal punishment would sort of be solved if we could go a step forward in this respect. Thank you very much for this very exciting and interesting discussion. Thank you to all the speakers, and thank you also to our audience. I think we have seen how important this topic is, and that it is a topic that affects all of us. The society, not whether we are people in uniform, whether we have certain mandates. No, it is challenges that exist for all of us. And if there are problems, then they have to be solved in respect as a society as a whole, so that the society eventually benefits from it and is empowered. It was a great pleasure talking about these things, and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation is definitely going to continue to have these debates. It is interesting to have seen how, and that a majority backs the people in uniform in our country, and that positive things are also happening. So, Miguel, back to you. Yes, thank you also from me for this very diverse and interesting debate. The discussion has shown how topical and relevant this is. And Annelies Stelzner said it, we're going to continue to focus on this subject in the foundation. So much for security. At 4:30, that is in 30 minutes, Lea Nischelwitzer will take over and will focus on the topic of participation. See you then.